Hello, I'm Annette Young and welcome back to the newsroom. Let's just take a look at what's making news this hour. And the moment of truth has finally arrived, with America deciding this Tuesday if indeed it will be Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton to be the country's next president. Also, Iraqi Kurdish fighters have gained control of Bashika, a town just east of Mosul, this a day after government forces on the southern front discovered a mass grave. Hungary's parliament has also rejected moves by Prime Minister Viktor Orban to block the settlement of refugees. And the European Union is calling on Turkey to resume political dialogue with opposition groups in order to safeguard its democracy. This as a trial of Reporters Without Borders representative begins in Istanbul. And coming up next is the second part of a special edition of the France24 Debate, which of course is coming to us from Washington with François Picard.
Welcome back to a special edition of the France24 Debate. We're in Washington, D.C., just a stone's throw away from the White House, and hours before the polls close, we're asking in part two, can Latinos, they make up 17% of the U.S. population, don't vote as much traditionally in U.S. elections. This time around, could they be the swing constituency? We're doing so in the company of Priscilla Alvarez, Associate Editor at The Atlantic. Thanks for joining us on what is a crazy busy day.
Yep, that's right.
All right. Also with us, Fernando Espuelas. He's an internet entrepreneur and a journalist. In the past, your radio talk show had brought in the likes of the current occupants of the building behind us. Now you work for The Hill and you are the host of the Espuelas podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Your life story, a sort of a capsule of the American dream. We'll talk about that perhaps a little bit later, but I want to begin with Priscilla and the article that you wrote last week for The Atlantic, in which you asked, you still didn't know, you wondered, will Latinos vote, and will they vote in large enough numbers for Hillary Clinton? Have you got a clearer answer at this point?
Well, we've seen early voting turnout, and in that case, we have seen that a drove of Latinos have come out, far more than they did in 2012. But what I was asking is, they usually lag behind white voters and black voters. So will they make up that ground in this election? And it appears that at least in early voting, we're seeing indications that they might. Now, it's also worth noting, however, that while they make up a considerable amount of the population, the white voters with no college education, voting age population is larger than Hispanics. So they do have to make a dent in that showing to really sway or make a big move in the election.
Why do they vote less traditionally?
That's a great question, and one we've been trying to answer for quite a while, but there is no definitive answer. I think what we're seeing in this election cycle is not only are they voting against Donald Trump, particularly among young Latino voters, but they're also voting in favor of Hillary Clinton, and that is over older Clinton supporters that are Latinos. So kind of seeing that balance has probably been the most interesting part of all of this. And actually, if we go back to the primary, they were largely the young Latino voters behind Bernie Sanders.
When we went knocking on doors in Virginia yesterday with canvassers for the Latino community, we did find outliers who are going to vote for Donald Trump. Why is that?
Well, so it's important to not consider the Latino voters as a monolith. We can't think of all of them swaying one way or the other. While they largely vote Democratic, Cuban Americans, for example, typically vote Republican. And in Florida, that's a huge story, is watching, will Cuban Americans stick to that? Will they vote Republican and vote for Donald Trump, or will they move and will they vote Democrat?
Fernando Espuelas, is it this monolithic blocks? I know Florida, it's what the Puerto Ricans vote Democrat, the Cubans vote Republican. Is that true?
Well, yeah, it's definitely not monolithic exactly, as Priscilla has said. The issue really is to your question, why don't more Latinos vote? I think it's cultural. I think many of us have come from Latin American countries that have no democratic tradition, so that's been passed on. And certainly there's been a lot of repression of Latino voters historically.
But they do now. I mean, it's been 20 years since the end of the military dictatorships.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that if you're not if you're not brought up in a political household where politics is spoken about at the same rate as soccer is, it's unlikely your children will be that politically connected. That's not an excuse, and I think what Priscilla points to, this outpouring of Hispanic voters, has a lot to do with Trump. Trump has done what no Democrat has been able to do. He's motivated Hispanics to finally vote.
Were you surprised when he made that very first announcement speech and he talked about Mexicans as rapists? Were you surprised?
I was completely shocked. I'm still completely shocked. It made no sense. It makes sense from the perspective that he was appealing to a very narrow group of voters who are prejudicial against Hispanics. But in terms of turning off the whole Hispanic population, regardless if they're Mexican American or not, he couldn't have said anything worse, really.
Priscilla Alvarez?
Well, regarding those statements, I think that really alienated Latino voters. I think that's pretty clear now. And it was a stunning moment for the Republican Party because if you go back to their 2012 autopsy report, one of the first things they said was they wanted to have more minority outreach. Latinos, particularly among that, Mitt Romney lost a lot of support compared to Obama, 27% compared to 71%. So I think particularly for the Republican Party, that was a big moment to really alienate a block of voters that they were hoping to seek out this election.
And why did voters ignore all that data you've been talking about?
In what regard? With the
Why is it that the Trump message worked?
Well, you have to consider, and this is something that you pointed to, is who he's going for, who his base is. And there's a lot of fear about immigrants and jobs and the economy. These are white voters without a college education largely, and this spoke to them, and this spoke to a resentment that they had, and he was able to capitalize on that and really surge. Is
there a more fundamental view that perhaps the United States is changing not in the way we think it is?
I don't know if that's correct. I think this has been a really tense election cycle. There is no doubt. It's been unusual. It's been highly contentious. And I think it's more so now looking forward. What happens after this? How does the Republican Party come back together, whoever wins? Because there are fractures, and that's been clear. And also in the Democratic Party. Remember, Bernie Sanders made it pretty far, and we need to consider that as well. So I think that'll be the story moving forward.
And that it particularly applies to Latino voters. You say they're energized by against Donald
Yes.
Trump. Will they stay interested in politics after this election's gone?
I think in that sense, voter groups have really capitalized on this moment, and they are out there and they are asking them to make voting a tradition within their families. And I think at the very least, perhaps Latinos that weren't politically engaged will be now. And you have to look at voter registration numbers, and they are really coming out, new Latinos to vote.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at a big reason why Hispanics lag behind in voting is because we're very young. Median age of Hispanics is 27, white voters is 43 or 44. So you have a lot of young people under 18 years of age. The question is this the catalyst election which turns a whole generation effectively into voters and regular voters? And this is bad news for the Republicans if that happens, because what's their experience thus far?
So bad news for the Republicans. That means that these voters are locked in with the Democrats for decades to come?
I don't think so. In fact, the largest group of new Hispanic voters are registering independent. And therefore, I think there's not an alliance to a party per se. There's much more an alliance to ideas and to candidates. And Republicans have not been able to escape their base in a way, or have not been able to bring their base along, I should say, to what is the reality of America today, which is much more demographically diverse. That's not going to change. It's only going to advance further. And if Republicans can't appeal, as Priscilla said, the autopsy from 2012 was pretty brutal. Stop spitting on Hispanics was basically, didn't say that, but it was the message. And they continued to do it. Therefore, it's very difficult to see how their leadership today evolves to something totally different when when the softest immigration stances that were taken during the primary, say by Jeb Bush, were roundly rejected.
Priscilla, following up on what Fernando said, are we seeing an America where there's growing intolerance, but at the same time growing tolerance in other sectors of the population?
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think that's the image that's been portrayed, and it's particularly with the heated rhetoric that's been used in this election. I hesitate to say that we're moving toward a more intolerant America, but
a part of America that's more intolerant,
Sure.
and another part that's more open to to people of different backgrounds?
You know, I would say that this is something that perhaps went unnoticed, that there were voters that had these feelings perhaps about immigrants and Latinos, and that they found a voice in Donald Trump. I wouldn't say it's new. Perhaps it was there, but it wasn't touched upon. And that is exactly what Donald Trump did. And even in his closing arguments, that's what we're hearing. We're not hearing the stronger together message that is Hillary Clinton. We're hearing a more pessimistic tone from Donald Trump.
More pessimistic tone. How does that ring with the Latino community? Would you say that they believe in the American dream, you know, that anybody can make it?
Well, I was out there too, and I was looking at voters in Virginia, and they weren't enthusiastically supporting Hillary Clinton. Some were, some weren't, but they were still happy about the United States. They look at economy. Immigration is not the only issue that they're looking at, and there appears to be sort of a positive look at the economy, and that's important. And so I would say that there still seems to be hope just from being on the field.
Fernando, you're the son of a single mother who takes you from Uruguay to a New York suburb, Greenwich, Connecticut.
Yeah.
She works as a house cleaner, and you grow up to be this guy who does big internet deals and becomes a journalist and everything. So you're one of these people you're the product of this American dream in a way.
Yeah, well, I'm a complete optimist about the United States, not just because of me, but because of what's happened in this country. I'm a historian by training, and look, Ben Franklin was complaining about these immigrants who were dark-skinned and dirty and wanted their own food and changed the name of the streets. He was talking about the Germans. So this has a history in the United States, and at one time it was the Irish, sometimes it was the Chinese, whatever. So this is maybe not our turn, but certainly because we are the biggest minority group today in terms of immigrant group, we're the target. And so the question is going to be not, are people more racist or not? There's a group of people who have always been racist who now are empowered to speak in a totally different way because of Trump. But the vast majority, according to surveys, the vast majority of Americans, I mean 60 plus, want immigration reform. They want a mechanism for citizenship for those people who are undocumented and so forth. So I think the core of the country, or the majority of the country, is really looking forward. And then there's, as Priscilla pointed out, there's a group of people who have been disadvantaged, perhaps through their own actions, perhaps victims of globalization or a combination, who are resentful. And but you know, I think Donald Trump is right when he says in his campaign speeches, this is our last election, and what he's trying to talk to that group of people. You know, if you don't vote now, you know, in the next 4 years, there's just going to be a different electorate, and your voice will not be heard, which is not true.
So do Latinos who've come in, do they share this economic anxiety that others have? That you know, the thing, I could be worse. My kids could be worse off than me.
You know, I don't know that, but the data in terms of income advancement, and particularly among Mexican Americans, they've done so well in this country over the last 10 years or so. I'm not sure they have that anxiety. I think the anxieties are economic in general. Am I going to have a job? Can I send my kids to college? Will I be able to afford health care and so forth? But in terms of, I mean, the construct of this country continues to be excellent for the future. And anybody who actually understands the economy knows that immigration, from wherever it comes, is the engine that keeps the economy growing.
And was that your personal experience when you were growing up and your name is Fernando?
No, I mean, so I was white in Uruguay, and then I got on a Pan Am flight and I landed in Connecticut, and I was no longer white. So we were the first Hispanic family in this town, and so I was the spick, and you know, people would try to beat me up and so forth. So my experience is that you can overcome whatever is there, but it takes a lot. It took my mom working 2 jobs so I could go to the best public schools in Connecticut, and then it took a lot of my effort as well. But that's the immigrant experience, and people do what they want with it. But the United States is open for business, for immigrants, and really, most people in this country could not care less that I was born in Uruguay or you were born in France. It doesn't matter.
Priscilla, is it a similar experience for you?
Well, my family is from Argentina, so we're sort of neighbors. And they had a similar experience, and they came into the United States with nothing, and they worked their way up. And they have an optimistic view of the United States despite the rhetoric that there's been now. And even in my reporting, I found that to be the case too. I spoke to one voter, and he is Hispanic, and he was older, and he's been waiting 20 years to vote. He's been in this country, and he became a citizen in 2014. And the optimism in his voice was uncanny. He was excited, and even with Donald Trump, the mention of Donald Trump's name, he laughed and kind of dismissed it and said, I'm going to vote, and that's the important part here. So I think that's still there.
Okay, so as we were saying, young population, growing clout, say both of you. How is that now? We've seen how it's impacted the Latinos coming in, or not, depending on how thick-skinned they are over these issues.
Yeah.
How's it going to impact the United States, a country that was founded mostly by Protestants? Is there going to be a sort of a Catholic strain, for instance? Here in Southern Europe, as you know, it's more Latin than how is that going to change America, and how's it going to change American politics?
So particularly on American politics, I think we're going to see a complete change. This could be really a turning point for American politics in the sense of how candidates address Latinos. There was a hint of it in the 2012 GOP autopsy report, but if they come out in droves this election,
but didn't we have it before? Didn't we have George W. Bush, who spoke in Spanish, and Kerry, who spoke in Spanish, and others?
But remember, it's a different Latino population. Most of them, a large portion of them are U.S. born. They're no longer just immigrants. They are part of the United States. And they view things differently. Perhaps immigration isn't the top anxiety that they have anymore, but it's the economy. And so it really changes how they are approached. They're another American, another ordinary American.
So it's a melting pot. So in other words, it's the Latinos that are going to adapt to the United States and not the other way around, is what you're saying.
Well, I think it's a mix of two, but remember, they're U.S. born. And so in that case, we have the same American that you have a Muslim American that's born here, so.
Well, I would agree with that. I think that the melting pot is happening, but it's a dynamic process where you have cultural influences. I always talk about the hot dog was once a German sausage called a Frankfurter, and it was probably very exotic, and now it's so American. And now we have burritos, and we have salsa, and we have all these things which are Latin but are no longer just Latin. So that fusion will continue. I think to your point in terms of Catholic, there is a difference because most Latin Americans who are Catholic follow the social gospel of the Catholic Church, which does not really coincide very well with the Republican principles of you're on your own, good luck, and don't call us, we'll call you. So I think when you listen to Tim Kaine, the vice presidential candidate, who's very Catholic, he is speaking the social gospel, and I think that's a really interesting dynamic where he sees policy through his religion without being overt or obnoxious about it. And I think that really is something that will play very well among Latinos going forward.
That's such an important point that you bring up. The Catholic Church, well, it's got its own cabinet, right? It's got a foreign minister and this sort of thing. It is a political body.
Sure.
And so the idea of a church that's also a political institution, how's that going to change U.S. politics? Because in America, as you've heard, there's a lot of resentment of Washington.
Well, I think so. Most Catholics in the United States, most women who are Catholic, have used birth control. So American Catholics are different in the sense that, yes, we respect the church, yes, we love the Pope, but we're not going to follow everything that happens from there. So I think what you'll see here is not a replica of Latin American Catholicism, but rather a fusion once again, where you're going to have this, I think, a preference for policies that help people, but not necessarily some religious code or some religious application of those principles.
I'm not hearing the same thing actually from Priscilla, because from what you're saying is that the American system, you sort of blend into it after a generation or two, and so this idea of perhaps a more benign view of government, that sort of fades away.
So what I would say is that so we're looking at this new Latino population, many of whom are U.S. born. And I would say that what I've spoken to some people about is how younger voters, let's say they're paired with another American that is also a younger voter but is a Latino, will consider their community more. And Fernando perhaps may speak to this as well, but they will think about the immigrant community and their family, and they will vote on behalf of that, which may not necessarily happen with another white American, a white voter. And in that sense, that's when you have a different electorate, right? Because they're not just thinking about themselves, but they're also voting on behalf of a community, and in that case, an immigrant community. So I would say in that case, that's a different dynamic at play here. But generally, I would say that we shouldn't look at this bloc as a monolithic bloc that only votes this way and does this. This is a different bloc that is changing and is integrating with the U.S. electorate.
I don't think we disagree. I think the issue is how that integration happens, who changes whom. And certainly, I'm much more American than I'm Uruguayan, obviously, because I've been here my whole life, essentially. But at the same time, I have my own perspective on things, which is very much informed by my Catholic background and my Latin American background. So my children, who are born in the United States, they're Hispanic, but at the same time, they're completely American. How will they be in 20 years? Who knows, right?
But do they speak Spanish?
One of them does, the other one does not. I've tried. But that's an issue as well. Many Hispanics don't speak Spanish, which is something that people don't want to talk about.
Sure.
The biggest group of Hispanics are actually bilingual or English only. The minority are Spanish-only speakers.
And how does that change the media picture of reaching out to Latinos? I mean, you have these huge U.S. cable networks that are in Spanish. Is that going to change as well?
Look, those networks have had to look to social media because that's where a lot of young Latinos who may only speak English or are bilingual, that is where they're going to look for to get their news. And that was the fascinating part about the Tim Kaine vice presidential pick, because he can speak Spanish, but how much does that matter anymore when so many Latinos either only speak English or are bilingual? Sure, it resonates with older voters, but what about the younger Latino voters who may not need a candidate to speak Spanish to them to relate or to want to vote for them? So that's where things are changing a lot, and there have been studies that show that you don't need to speak, or so they show now, you don't need to speak Spanish to identify as a Latino. And that's new. That used to be part of the identity.
Well, I'm completely right. My son and his friends, they call themselves reverse coconuts because they're white on the outside and brown on the inside. And he doesn't speak Spanish, but he does identify with being Hispanic. So I think this is going to be, it's a fascinating process.
And how much do they identify with Latin America? We see the violence in countries like Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador. We see the fall of Chavismo in Venezuela. Are these things that matter to Latinos in the United States?
I'm now going to speculate because I haven't seen data on this. I would say it matters for a certain generation. It probably doesn't matter to the people Priscilla just described. I mean, it matters in the same way something else happening in some other part of the world may happen. But unless it's the country of your family's origin, I don't think it's that.
Well, because some people, they have what's called the ladder theory, right? You're the last one in, so you want to pull the ladder up. And so Mexico's not my problem, or the...
I think what was so fascinating about Trump's insults against undocumented Mexican immigrants was that we all felt it. I'm not of Mexican descent. I'm not undocumented. I'm certainly not a criminal. But I immediately identified that he was talking about me, which may be irrational, but millions of other people had the same reaction. So I think, there's more. The research shows that there's more identification between Hispanics of second generation, regardless of country of origin, than there are between immigrants from two different countries.
There's always been pendulum swings in U.S. history between isolationism and being outgoing and interested in the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. Sometimes too much to the taste of some countries and some people. Do you think this Latino community, as it integrates, is going to have a different kind of look on Central and South America than the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically treating the rest of the continent as not a colony, perhaps, but a protectorate?
Sure, and I'm with Fernando here. I would have to speculate on that. But what I will say is that What we're seeing, and this is also cultural again, is that Latinos, I think, typically work within that family and within that community. And so if there are immigrants in that community, Mexican immigrants, I feel like there's sort of a connection there, a dynamic there at play that is completely rooted in culture, the Latino culture. And so I would be speculating to say that they would look at Latin America or South America differently, but perhaps in an immigrant community where you have several Mexican immigrants, perhaps with Cuba, you have Cuban Americans, maybe you'll have a different outlook simply because of your connection to that community.
Maybe a different outlook. Fernando, do you see U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America evolving as the Latino community gains more clout, or has it already evolved with the Obama visit to Cuba, with the fact that Americans are involved in the negotiations with Venezuela and Colombia with their domestic problems?
I'm a huge critic of American policy towards Latin America. I think that the United States has essentially forgotten Latin America because it's reasonably stable relative to the rest of the world, the third world anyway. And I think that there have been a lot of missed opportunities, especially as China has infiltrated economically most of Latin America. The United States stood aside, focused on Iraq and Afghanistan and other issues as well. So in terms of American foreign policy, I think that Monroe Doctrine is over unless there's an invasion of a country. But what I think remains is this reality, this geographic reality, and the trade routes that are there. And therefore, I think American policy eventually will rediscover Latin America beyond the drug issues and beyond the immigration issues, and really see core allies there, like Brazil, like Mexico, like Argentina, and other major countries there as well.
All right, so rediscovering of the rest of America to be in the future predicts Fernando Espuelas. Fernando, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's going to be a tense night here in Washington. I want to thank as well Priscilla Alvarez. Good luck burning the midnight oil as those returns come in.
I'll have coffee.
And our coverage of election night goes through the night on France 24. Thank you for joining us here from Washington, D.C.
Today and all through the night, join us on France24 and RFI to follow the US elections. In-depth reports, debates and election specials. More than 12 hours of live reporting to help you understand and experience the event. From 10 p.m. Paris time, RFI and France24 will pool their efforts to bring you the best coverage of the vote. Get the results live during the night. Our teams are in Paris, Washington and other key American cities to report for you and reveal the next president of the United States. The US presidential election today on France 24 and RFI.